Leave. This family has suffered enough outsiders. The words landed across the front lawn like a slammed door. Richard Carter stood at the bottom of the wide stone steps leading to the old family home, his arms folded tightly across his chest as if he alone had the authority to decide who belonged there. Behind him, dozens of guests dressed in black moved quietly beneath white canopy tents, their voices low, their attention fixed on the memorial gathering taking place inside the Carter estate. Malcolm Carter stood motionless at the front gate, one hand resting on the handle of a small overnight bag. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply looked past Richard toward the sprawling southern mansion that sat on nearly 12 acres of land outside Savannah, Georgia. The house looked smaller than he remembered. Maybe that was because he had spent 20 years carrying it in his mind. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Malcolm. The morning air was warm, already pushing 80 degrees despite the early hour. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees that lined the driveway like silent witnesses. Malcolm had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways during long nights in boardrooms and private flights across the country. None of those versions included being treated like a stranger standing outside his own family's gate. Richard glanced him up and down. The tailored navy jacket. The polished shoes. The calm expression. None of it mattered. In Richard's eyes, Malcolm was still an outsider. "The service is private," Richard said. "Family only." Malcolm felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger. Not surprise. Something older. Something familiar. He had seen that look before. The look people gave when they had already decided who you were before hearing a single word. A black SUV rolled slowly down the circular driveway behind the house. Guests continued arriving. No one paid attention to the man standing at the gate. No one recognized him. No one knew that the last time Malcolm had stood on this property, he had been a boy barely tall enough to see over the porch railing. 22 years had passed since then. 22 years since his mother packed 2 suitcases and drove away from this place with tears in her eyes and silence in her heart. Richard stepped forward. "You heard me. Turn around and leave." Malcolm looked at him carefully. The resemblance was impossible to miss. Same family blood. Same family name. Yet the distance between them felt larger than the 1,000 miles Malcolm had traveled to get there. Somewhere inside the house, a grandfather clock chimed. The sound drifted through an open window and across the lawn. Malcolm stared at the front door. The door his mother had once promised would open again someday. The door everyone else seemed determined to keep closed. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Richard laughed softly. "That's exactly what trouble usually says." And just like that, the gathering continued around them, unaware that the most important member of the Carter family had already arrived. Richard remained planted at the foot of the steps, convinced the conversation was over, but Malcolm did not move. The driveway curved through the property like a ribbon of memory, carrying guests toward a home that had once belonged to his childhood. Luxury sedans rolled past him one after another. Some drivers glanced his way, assuming he was staff. Others did not notice him at all. It was a strange feeling, becoming invisible on land connected to his own family history. Malcolm adjusted his grip on the overnight bag and looked toward the second-floor windows. Somewhere behind those walls hung decades of photographs, family portraits, holiday gatherings, and milestones. His mother should have been in many of them. Instead, her absence had become part of the house itself. 22 years earlier, Denise Carter had left this estate with her young son and a promise she never fully explained. She never spoke badly about the family. She never told Malcolm to hate them. Whenever he asked why they stayed away, she would simply smile and say, "Some doors take longer to open than others." For most of his life, Malcolm believed those doors would remain closed forever. Then 3 weeks earlier, a letter arrived at his penthouse in Chicago. No return address. No signature on the envelope. Inside was a single invitation to a memorial service honoring William Carter, Malcolm's grandfather. At the bottom, written in careful handwriting that trembled slightly across the page, were 4 words. "Please come home, Malcolm." He had stared at those words for nearly an hour. Despite building one of the largest technology consulting firms in America, despite appearing on magazine covers and speaking before thousands of executives, nothing had unsettled him more than that simple message. Richard cleared his throat. "I am serious. You need to leave before you embarrass yourself." Malcolm looked at him calmly. "I came because someone invited me." Richard laughed without humor. "Nobody invited you." The certainty in his voice revealed more than he intended. It sounded rehearsed, as though the family had spent years pretending certain names no longer existed. A group of relatives crossed the front lawn carrying programs from the memorial service. Malcolm recognized none of them. They walked by without acknowledging him, their conversations continuing uninterrupted. The distance between stranger and family member seemed to depend entirely on who controlled the story. Richard had controlled it for years. Malcolm could feel it. Then the front door opened. Guests turned instinctively toward the house. The movement rippled across the lawn like wind through tall grass. Someone important had appeared. Richard immediately straightened his jacket and stepped aside. Malcolm followed the direction of everyone's attention. Standing in the doorway was a woman in her late 70s, supported gently by a polished wooden cane. Even from 50 yards away, her presence changed the atmosphere. Conversation softened. People moved respectfully out of her path. Malcolm felt his heartbeat slow and then quicken again. He had not seen Evelyn Carter since he was 10 years old. Yet somehow he recognized her instantly. And as her eyes slowly scanned the crowd, it became impossible to ignore one question. Had she been the one who sent the letter? Evelyn Carter remained in the doorway for several seconds, her silver hair catching the morning sunlight as conversations across the estate gradually faded into silence. Malcolm could not tell whether she had seen him yet. Her eyes moved slowly from guest to guest, greeting relatives with small nods while family members gathered around her with careful attention. Richard immediately climbed the steps toward her, eager to position himself beside the matriarch of the family. Malcolm watched from the edge of the driveway as generations of Carters formed a circle around the woman who had become the center of the entire gathering. It looked less like a memorial and more like a kingdom protecting its crown. The distance between Malcolm and the house suddenly felt greater than 50 yards. It felt like 22 years. A man carrying a memorial program stopped near Malcolm and glanced at him briefly. "Catering is around back," he said before continuing toward the lawn. Another guest assumed Malcolm was event staff and handed him an empty water bottle without even making eye contact. Malcolm accepted it silently. The small moment should not have bothered him. He had spent years sitting across from Fortune 500 executives, negotiating contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet standing here, surrounded by his own bloodline, he felt the familiar sting of being reduced to someone else's assumption. Near the front porch, Richard appeared completely comfortable. He laughed with relatives. He greeted arriving guests. He spoke as though he represented the entire family. Malcolm noticed something else. Every conversation seemed to orbit around Richard's version of history. Whenever older relatives mentioned the past, certain names disappeared. Certain stories ended abruptly. Certain subjects never surfaced at all. It was as if entire chapters of the family had been quietly removed from the book. Malcolm spotted a large display of framed photographs arranged beside the entrance. Images stretched across decades. Weddings. Graduations. Holidays. Military uniforms. Family reunions. He studied them from afar. His grandfather appeared in dozens. Evelyn appeared in nearly all of them. Richard appeared often. Yet one face was missing. Denise Carter. His mother. The absence hit harder than any insult Richard had thrown at him. The photographs told a story, but it was incomplete. Someone had carefully edited the narrative. A breeze moved through the oak trees overhead, carrying the scent of fresh flowers from the memorial arrangements. Malcolm remembered standing beside his mother in a small apartment outside Atlanta when he was 13 years old. She had opened an old photo album one rainy afternoon and shown him pictures from this very estate. Her fingers lingered on faces that no longer called. Her smile never fully reached her eyes. "Family is complicated," she had said softly. "Sometimes people convince themselves that forgetting is easier than healing." At the time, Malcolm had not understood. Standing here now, he finally did. A sudden movement near the porch pulled him back to the present. An elderly woman dressed in a navy housekeeping uniform had stepped out from a side entrance carrying folded linens. She froze the moment she looked toward the driveway. The stack of linens lowered slowly in her hands. Her eyes widened. Unlike everyone else, she was not looking at Malcolm with confusion. She was looking at him with recognition. The elderly woman stood completely still beside the side entrance, her eyes fixed on Malcolm as though she had seen a ghost step out of the past. Around her, guests continued moving across the lawn, unaware that something important had just shifted. Malcolm recognized her a moment later. Clara Benson. She had worked at the Carter estate for as long as he could remember. When he was a child, she used to sneak extra peach cobbler onto his plate during family dinners and tell him stories while the adults argued inside the house. Time had added silver to her hair and lines to her face, but her expression remained the same. Kind. Steady. Certain. Clara set the folded linens on a nearby bench and slowly walked toward the driveway. Each step seemed to carry years of memories with it. Richard noticed her movement immediately. His smile faded. He descended the porch steps and intercepted her before she could reach Malcolm. "Clara," he said sharply. "The guests need help inside." Clara did not look away from Malcolm. "I know who needs help," she replied quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. The air between them changed. Malcolm could sense history underneath the exchange, old conversations and old disagreements buried beneath decades of silence. Clara finally reached the edge of the driveway and stopped a few feet from Malcolm. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Her eyes searched his face. The shape of his jaw. The way he stood. The calm expression that seemed inherited from another generation. Then she smiled. It was small at first, almost fragile. "You look just like your grandfather," she whispered. The words landed with surprising force. Malcolm had spent most of his life hearing that he looked like his mother. No one had ever told him he resembled William Carter. Clara's eyes filled with emotion. "I knew the second I saw you." Richard stepped forward immediately. "That is enough." Clara turned toward him. "No. It is not enough. It has never been enough." Several nearby relatives had begun paying attention now. Conversation slowed. Curious glances drifted toward the driveway. Richard lowered his voice. "You are creating a scene." Clara gave a soft laugh. "The scene was created 22 years ago." The words hung in the air. Malcolm noticed a few older family members exchange uncomfortable looks. They remembered. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Clara turned back toward Malcolm. "Your mother used to stand right over there by the fountain when she wanted a little peace." She pointed toward a stone fountain partially hidden beneath oak trees. "She would sit with a book while everyone else argued about things that never mattered." Malcolm followed her gaze. He could almost see it. His mother sitting beneath the trees. Young. Hopeful. Believing there was still a place for her here. Clara's smile faded. She never stopped loving this family, even after they made it difficult. Before Malcolm could respond, Clara glanced toward the second-floor windows of the house. Her expression changed. A secret seemed to pass behind her eyes. "There are things inside that house you deserve to know," she said softly. Things that prove you were never forgotten. Richard immediately stepped between them. That conversation is over. But for the first time all morning, Malcolm noticed something unexpected. Richard did not look angry. He looked worried. Richard's concern lingered in Malcolm's mind long after the conversation ended. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it had been there. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Malcolm sensed that something larger than family tension was hiding beneath the surface. Clara gathered the folded linens and quietly returned toward the side entrance, but not before giving Malcolm one last look. It was the look of someone carrying a truth for far too long. The memorial service was scheduled to begin within the hour. Guests slowly migrated toward rows of white chairs arranged beneath the oak trees. Soft instrumental music drifted across the lawn. Servers carried trays of lemonade and iced tea between small groups of relatives. From a distance, the gathering appeared elegant and peaceful. Up close, Malcolm could feel the fractures running underneath it. He wandered toward the fountain Clara had mentioned earlier. Water spilled gently over worn stone, creating the only honest sound on the property. Here, away from the conversations and polite smiles, memory surfaced more easily. He remembered being 8 years old and sitting beside his mother in a tiny apartment kitchen outside Atlanta. Rain tapped against the windows while she sorted through a box of old family photographs. One picture showed her standing on the front porch of this estate, laughing beside her father. Another showed Evelyn holding Malcolm as a baby. He remembered asking why they never visited anymore. Denise had stared at the photograph for several seconds before answering. "Some people think love comes with conditions," she said. "Your grandfather never believed that. Neither did your grandmother." At the time, Malcolm had not understood why tears appeared in her eyes afterward. Years later, he finally did. A shadow crossed the fountain. Malcolm looked up and noticed a narrow staircase partially hidden behind a hedge near the side of the house. It led toward an upper section of the estate rarely visible from the lawn. The sight triggered an unexpected memory. As a child, he had climbed those stairs searching for a lost baseball. At the top had been a dusty storage room beneath the attic. He remembered old trunks, family records, and shelves filled with boxes no one seemed to touch. More importantly, he remembered his grandfather telling him that every family keeps its history somewhere. "The truth always survives," William Carter had said. "People hide it. They deny it. They rewrite it. But eventually it waits for someone willing to look." Malcolm stared toward the staircase. Clara's words returned. "There are things inside that house you deserve to know." A chill moved through him despite the warm Georgia air. Near the porch, he noticed Clara again. She stood beside a doorway, pretending to organize supplies. When their eyes met, she glanced briefly toward the hidden staircase before looking away. The gesture lasted less than a second. It was enough. Malcolm followed her gaze. Whatever secret had kept his mother's name absent from photographs and conversations for more than 2 decades was still somewhere inside this house. And for the first time, he began to suspect that someone had spent years making sure it stayed hidden. The memorial service began beneath the oak trees as sunlight filtered through the hanging moss, casting long shadows across the rows of white chairs. Guests settled into their seats while soft music faded into silence. Malcolm remained near the edge of the gathering, close enough to hear every word yet distant enough to remind everyone that he had never truly been welcomed. From his position, he could see Evelyn seated in the front row. Age had slowed her movements, but not her presence. Even now, people deferred to her without thinking. She carried authority the way some people carried titles. Quietly. Naturally. As speakers stepped forward to share stories about William Carter, Malcolm listened carefully. They spoke of business achievements, charitable donations, and family traditions. They described a man who valued loyalty above convenience and truth above comfort. Yet with every tribute, something felt incomplete. No one mentioned Denise. No one spoke about the daughter who disappeared from family history. It was as if an entire branch of the Carter family tree had been trimmed away and everyone had agreed never to ask why. Malcolm watched Evelyn throughout the service. Several times her gaze drifted beyond the crowd. Each time it seemed to settle near the driveway where he stood. Then she would look away again, as though waiting for something. The ceremony ended shortly before noon. Guests rose from their seats and slowly returned to the house for lunch. Conversations resumed. Laughter mixed uneasily with grief. The estate began to feel crowded again. Malcolm remained where he was until he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Clara stood beside him, careful not to attract attention. "There is not much time," she said quietly. Malcolm turned toward her. "What is everyone hiding?" Clara looked toward the house before answering. "Not everyone. Just the people who benefited from the silence." The words settled heavily between them. Clara lowered her voice even further. "Your grandmother never accepted what happened." "Not for one day." Malcolm felt his heartbeat quicken. Clara continued. "After your mother left, Evelyn kept her room exactly the same. When you stopped visiting, she kept yours too." Malcolm stared at her. "For 22 years?" Clara nodded. "Nobody was allowed inside except her." A breeze moved across the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes sounded from the back porch. Clara's eyes softened. Every birthday she placed a gift in that room. Every Christmas too. Sometimes she would sit in there for hours. Malcolm struggled to process the image. While he had spent years believing he had been forgotten, someone inside this house had been preserving his place the entire time. Clara glanced toward the second floor. "The room is still there." Before Malcolm could respond, a voice interrupted from across the lawn. Richard was approaching quickly. The moment he saw Clara speaking with Malcolm, his expression hardened. Clara stepped back immediately. But not before whispering one final sentence. "She sent the letter." Richard arrived seconds later. "Lunch is for family only," he said coldly. Yet this time the words carried less confidence than before. Because for the first time all day, Malcolm knew something Richard desperately wished had remained hidden. Evelyn Carter had never stopped waiting for him to come home. Richard stood between Malcolm and the front steps as relatives streamed toward the house for lunch, but the balance of power had already begun to shift. Malcolm could see it in the curious glances now directed his way. People were asking questions. Quiet questions. The kind that spread through families faster than announcements. Why was Clara speaking to him? Why had Evelyn kept looking toward the driveway? Why did Richard seem so determined to keep him outside? The answers were moving closer. The front doors of the estate opened once again. Conversation softened almost immediately. Heads turned. Evelyn Carter emerged slowly onto the porch, her cane tapping gently against the polished wood beneath her feet. Two relatives stepped forward to assist her, but she waved them away. The gesture was small, yet it carried unmistakable authority. She wanted to walk on her own. The crowd parted naturally as she descended the steps. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Malcolm felt his chest tighten as she moved across the lawn. Not toward the dining room. Not toward the guests waiting for her attention. Toward him. Richard noticed it too. His face lost color. "Grandmother," he called carefully. "Lunch is ready." Evelyn did not stop. "It can wait," she replied. The words were calm, but they cut through the gathering like a bell. Guests exchanged uncertain looks. Family members fell silent. Even the servers paused. Malcolm remained where he stood. Every step Evelyn took seemed to erase another year of separation. 22 years. 22 birthdays. 22 Christmas mornings. 22 years of unanswered questions. When she finally reached him, she stopped only a few feet away. Her eyes searched his face. Not with uncertainty. Not with curiosity. With recognition. Tears gathered in her eyes. For a moment she simply looked at him, as if memorizing features she had imagined 1,000 times but had not seen in decades. Then her hand slowly rose and rested against his cheek. A collective silence settled across the estate. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Evelyn smiled through tears. "William was right," she whispered. "You have his eyes." Malcolm felt emotion rise unexpectedly in his throat. All morning he had been treated like a stranger. All morning he had stood outside the family circle. Yet in that single moment, none of it mattered. Evelyn's voice grew stronger. Strong enough for everyone nearby to hear. "My grandson." The words echoed across the lawn. Shock rippled through the crowd. Several relatives looked toward Richard. Others stared directly at Malcolm. Clara lowered her head and smiled quietly. Evelyn took Malcolm's hand in both of hers. "I waited a long time for this day." Malcolm swallowed hard. "You sent the letter?" Evelyn nodded. "Of course I did." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I was not going to leave this world without seeing you come home." Richard stepped forward nervously. "Grandmother, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Evelyn turned toward him. For the first time that day, her expression hardened. "There is nothing private about family." Then she looked back at Malcolm and squeezed his hand gently. The next words changed everything. "Come inside, son. You belong here." The silence that followed Evelyn's words seemed to stretch across the entire estate. Guests stood frozen beneath the oak trees. Relatives who had spent years accepting one version of the family's history suddenly found themselves staring at a different truth. Malcolm remained beside Evelyn, still holding her hand, while shock moved through the crowd in quiet waves. Richard looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. For years he had controlled the narrative. He had decided which stories were repeated and which were buried. Now that carefully constructed version of the past was unraveling in front of everyone. Evelyn turned toward the house and gently tugged Malcolm forward. Together they walked up the front steps. No one blocked their path. No one questioned them. The same doorway that had seemed impossible to cross only hours earlier now stood open. As Malcolm stepped inside, memories rushed toward him from every corner of the foyer. The polished staircase. The crystal chandelier. The grandfather clock standing against the wall. Time had passed, yet so much remained unchanged. Several relatives followed them into the house. Curiosity had replaced certainty. Questions replaced assumptions. Clara appeared near the hallway entrance and smiled quietly as Malcolm crossed the threshold. She had waited years to see this moment. Evelyn led him through the foyer and toward a staircase at the rear of the house. Richard followed several steps behind. His confidence was gone. In its place was something closer to dread. They climbed slowly to the second floor. Family members gathered below, watching. Nobody knew exactly where Evelyn was taking him, but everyone sensed it mattered. At the end of the hallway stood a white door. The paint was older than the rest of the house. The brass handle showed signs of use despite the years. Evelyn stopped in front of it and rested her hand against the wood. Tears filled her eyes once again. "Open it," she said softly. Malcolm hesitated before turning the handle. The room beyond was perfectly preserved. Dust-free. Organized. Waiting. A twin bed stood beneath the window. Shelves lined the walls. Baseball trophies sat exactly where a child would have left them. Books remained stacked beside the desk. Even a faded Chicago Cubs cap rested on a shelf near the closet. Malcolm stepped inside slowly, unable to speak. It was his room. The room he had used as a boy during family visits more than 2 decades ago. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been forgotten. Evelyn entered behind him. "Every year they told me it was time to clear it out," she said. "Every year I refused." Malcolm noticed wrapped gift boxes arranged neatly inside the closet. Dozens of them. Birthdays. Christmases. Milestones. Years of love stored quietly in a room nobody else understood. Family members standing in the hallway stared in disbelief. Richard lowered his eyes. The evidence was impossible to deny now. While some people had worked to erase Malcolm from the family story, Evelyn had spent 22 years protecting his place in it. Malcolm picked up one of the gifts and looked toward his grandmother. She smiled through tears. "You were never the one who left us," she said. "You were the one we failed to bring home." Malcolm stood in the center of the room for a long moment, surrounded by 22 years of evidence that love had never disappeared. The gifts remained unopened. The books remained untouched. Even the small scratches on the wooden desk seemed preserved by time itself. Downstairs, conversations had faded into a distant murmur. The entire house felt different now. Secrets that had survived for decades were finally losing their power. Evelyn sat beside the window and watched her grandson take in the room she had protected all these years. There was relief in her eyes, but also sadness. Not sadness for what had happened today. Sadness for everything that had been lost before this day ever arrived. Malcolm carefully placed the gift box back on the shelf and sat beside her. Neither of them spoke immediately. Some moments were too important for quick words. Outside, sunlight poured across the estate grounds. Guests continued gathering beneath the trees, but the center of the story was no longer on the lawn. It was here. In a room that had waited patiently for someone to come home. Finally, Evelyn reached into a drawer beside the bed and removed a stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. She handed them to Malcolm. "Your grandfather wrote these," she said softly. Malcolm looked down at the bundle. There were dozens of envelopes. Some yellowed with age. Others newer. None had ever been mailed. "He wrote to you every year," Evelyn explained. "Even after he knew the letters would never be sent." Malcolm opened the top envelope. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's. Strong. Careful. Familiar. His eyes moved across the first lines. William spoke about missing him. About hoping life was treating him well. About believing that one day the family would find its way back together. Malcolm swallowed hard. His grandfather had never stopped thinking about him. Never stopped hoping. Never stopped believing. A quiet knock sounded at the doorway. Richard stood there alone. Gone was the certainty that had followed him all morning. He looked older now. Smaller somehow. For several seconds he struggled to find words. Then he lowered his eyes. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The admission hung in the room. No excuses. No explanations. Just truth. Malcolm studied him for a moment. The anger he might have carried years ago was gone. Standing in this room, surrounded by proof of enduring love, resentment suddenly felt too small. "We all lost time," Malcolm replied. "That is punishment enough." Richard nodded slowly. He understood. As evening approached, family members gathered for one final photograph on the front lawn. This time Malcolm stood beside Evelyn. No one questioned his place. No one asked whether he belonged. The answer had already been given. After the camera flashed, Evelyn slipped her arm through his and smiled. The same house that had once felt closed now felt open. The same family that had seemed distant now felt possible. Not perfect. Not healed overnight. But possible. And as the sun settled behind the Georgia oaks, Malcolm realized something that years of success had never taught him. Sometimes the greatest victory is not building an empire. Sometimes it is discovering that the place you thought had forgotten you never stopped waiting for your return. Evelyn squeezed his hand gently and looked toward the horizon. Malcolm smiled. For the first time in 22 years, home was no longer a memory. It was a place he could finally walk into without standing at the gate.